other than world religions. So the merger has been a happy one for the most part, and it's saved both programs, at least for now. But as you know, the state of Ohio and the way that it funds education has progressively cut what is called the state share of instruction for higher ed, and has created problems with revenue at our uh, public university, with the exception of OSC, which is a little bit 1,000 pound drugs on the platform.
Well, I'd like to welcome Logan Lybarger. Lauren and I met at Interfaith Justice Breakfast several years ago, and then we subsequently got together for a coffee, and I learned that Lauren's grandparents were members of the church that I had grown up in Worcester, Ohio, and his grandfather was responsible for making sure that there was an amazing tree cover in Worcester, Ohio. And so it was a great deeper kind of connection that we had. And he and I were just having coffee a couple Fridays ago, and of course we're talking about Gaza, and asked him at the last minute if he might be able to come and join us for this class today, and he agreed. So thank you so much for being here.
Yeah. Well, thank you, Dave. And as Dave mentioned, our families are intertwined. My mother was born and grew up there, and it was really wonderful happenstance to sort of sit down next together at this breakfast. So my name is Logan Lybarger. I teach at Ohio University in the Department of Classics and Religious Studies, and my area is Islamic Studies. I did my PhD at the Divinity School at the University of Chicago, finished that in 2002, and prior to that, I studied theology at the Lutheran School of Theology at Chicago. Prior to that, I have a linguistics degree from the American University in Cairo. And did I say Lutheran School of Theology, Chicago? Yes, Cairo is. So and prior to that, I lived in the Middle East for many years. So I went to the Middle East in 1986, right after I graduated from college, and worked there in a small school in Beit Jala, which is a predominantly Palestinian Christian town, just west of Bethlehem, within walking distance of Bethlehem. I've walked that distance. You probably want to take a taxi or something. Beit Jala. Bethlehem is on the top of this hill, very tall hill. It's quite a steep climb. You were sharing Christmas memories this morning, so I thought I'd share one of mine briefly. In 1980, this must have been in 1987, the Christmas of '87, maybe before the start of the first Palestinian uprising. And I had been invited to play my guitar at the Lutheran Church in Bethlehem. I don't think I played very well. I was just happy to get through the and I was playing my guitar through Bethlehem, my first Christmas in Bethlehem, my first Christmas in the Middle East. And I was on my own, and I was just walking, through the throngs of people in the city. All these tourists, come and to be in Bethlehem, and the Israeli military, the West Bank, where Bethlehem is situated, was occupied Palestinian territory, has been since 1967. And so the Israeli military has maintained a very prominent presence in Bethlehem. And during these moments, like Christmas, when there's a lot of tourism, the military comes in and establishes an even heavier security. So there were multiple checkpoints. And I thought I would just, go down Major Street toward, what's the street? I forget what the name of the street. It's Cobbled Street. From the Bethlehem Lutheran Church to the Church of the Nativity, the Basilica, that dates back to the period of Constantine and the Byzantine period, right? I mean, this is not the original structure, but some of that structure dates back that far. And as I was walking through, going through the checkpoints, somebody called out to me in the side alley. It was this friend of mine, Yusuf. I just met him. He does some student teaching for us. He was a student at Bethlehem University, finishing up his education degree. He called out to me. He was sitting in front of a store in front of the store with a charcoal grid, the charcoal what do you call them?
Dangerous.
Yeah,
Hibachi sort of thing.
yes, exactly. And he was making some Turkish coffee, and he invited me to sit down. Yusuf is a Muslim, and we sat down, and all of these European tourists, some of them drunk, just these young people there for the party, were walking by. It was a very surreal scene. It was about midnight, and I ended up sitting there in front of that hibachi with Yusuf, where he was telling me, he was asking me what I knew about the Quran. And I didn't know much about the Quran at the time. And Yusuf then began to tell me, well, we tell the story of Jesus and Mary in the Quran. Like, really? Well, can you tell me about that? And so for the next 2 hours, he told me this story, and we got into a long conversation about, how Muslims and Christians understand this story and the ways that they overlap and ways that they don't. And it was really a fascinating kind of moment and a very surreal set of circumstances with these European tourists milling around. And about 2 a.m, I took the long walk back to the Beit Shal. And so that was my Christmas Eve, and waking up this morning on my own. But having that conversation with you was quite unlikely to be there. So today, Dave's invitation, I come here to talk with you about Palestine, about Israel, and about the war in Gaza. I mean, I'm sure that you've been following the news, although the war has now slipped to maybe the second or third news feed. It has been a quite devastating moment, very difficult for me personally. I have friends in Gaza, one of whom, a prominent human rights attorney, Roger Sodani, had his home bombed and thankfully was able to escape with his family. He's described that experience. I live in Remal, a middle class section of Gaza City, and that entire area has been now completely blown to bits, as the rest of most of the city of Gaza and elsewhere. So it's been quite a devastating moment. I have friends in the Unzadok refugee camp, which is kind of in the middle of the Gaza Strip, and that too has been heavily bombed. I don't know whether those friends are still living or whether they've been displaced. So this event has been sort of deeply personal for me. And of course, the violence in the West Bank has continued without delay, without ceasing. In fact, the Israeli settlers, have seen an opportunity to push forward their program of pushing Palestinians out and confiscating land, building settlements, all part of an effort and a program to try to establish Israeli dominance facts on the ground in the West Bank. So today I just want to rather go over, how much time do we have here?
I think you said till 12:30.
Okay. I'll try not to take up time. I put this together last night, and so I apologize for the roughness of it. It's not as polished as I would like it, and it's probably way too detailed. But I'll walk through this with you. It's a lot of background to try to understand how it is that we've come to this moment in Gaza, where we are seeing this, utter devastating destruction of this area. How do we arrive at this? And you see an image here of an area that was heavily bombed, but this is kind of what it is like now in Gaza. It's hard not to conclude from what we are viewing that there is a strategy here to completely destroy the civilian infrastructure as well as inflict massive loss of life. And it's, in other words, one has to ask, why this policy of massive destruction? We know that 50% of the munitions that have been dropped on Gaza are dumb bombs. These are munitions that are just indiscriminate. When they land, they miss their targets. The whole point is to kill and to destroy quite massively, to make Gaza uninhabitable. At least half the population, 1 million more people, have been displaced and forced into ever shrinking areas. And there's great fear that the next step is mass expulsion. And this is something that Palestinians have experienced. Really, it's sort of their national narrative. It is a kind of narrative of not becoming a nation. Rather, it is a narrative of the destruction of a nation. beginning in 1948 with what the Palestinians call the Nakba, the catastrophe. The catastrophe. This is the very same year that Israel celebrates its independence. So you have this kind of very strange moment in May, every May, where Israelis celebrate their independence and Palestinians hang black flags in commemoration of the destruction of their society in 1948, when 750,000 Palestinians were forced against their will from their towns into exile, into refugee camps. So there's a real poignancy here, and trauma. There's real trauma here, right? So when this is happening, this is simply re-traumatizing, reawakening these memories of the Nakba, and the very possibility of another mass expulsion, another reliving of the Nakba, another turn of the Nakba, of the catastrophe. For Palestinians, it has been one catastrophe after another, and the whole long litany of events from 1948. Actually preceding 1948, but really from the 1920s onward. This has been a 100-year war. And at every turn, Palestinians have lost this war. So you're going to be hearing this. A lot of this is from the perspective of Palestinians. I want to say, though, at the outset here that Israelis and Jews are also obviously a deeply traumatized people. And so we have a history here of two deeply traumatized people who have competing narratives, competing claims to the same territory, but unequal power, right? And one people has succeeded, one people has been defeated, and this is a situation that we find ourselves in. Just these recurring cycles of violence that reinstill the traumas, right? Okay. So what is the immediate situation? You probably might know this, but currently, you might know that on October 7th, the Islamic resistance movement, Hamas, launched a surprise attack across the boundary fence that separates Gaza from Israel. And in this attack, the Israelis who had created this multi-million-dollar, highly technological feat of border wall building, the kind of thing that our former President Trump was attempting to do on our southern border, build a wall with all the technology and all of that. The Israelis did. And Hamas managed to overcome that and to enter into Israel proper and carry out an attack that resulted in the killing of 695 Israeli civilians. Another 36 of them were children, and then another 373 military personnel were also killed in this attack, and there were 71 foreigners, and this comes to a total of approximately 1,139, slightly less than the 1,200 figure that you see frequently quoted in the news media. This comes from France 24. I didn't have a chance to really follow that up, but I'm not quoting these figures to minimize, other than to point out that this was a mix of civilians and military that were killed. So the Hamas had targeted military sites, military bases, but then found themselves entering into these communities, Kibbutzim and other communities, and they went door to door and they slaughtered non-combatant civilians. So I need to say that up front. This was an atrocity. It was a crime against humanity. It falls under the legal definition of crime against humanity. It was a war crime. And 240 hostages approximately were taken back to Gaza. And this has been an ongoing kind of unresolved situation. Families of hostages in Israel are demonstrating and demanding that the Israeli government do more to win the release of these hostages. There was a clause in the fighting that allowed for the release of hostages in exchange for Palestinian prisoners. We'll talk about prisoners in a second.
Can I ask you a quick question?
Yeah.
Has hostage taking been a common or a used practice on part of Hezbollah or Hamas or whoever? Can you say anything about the history on hostage situations?
Well, you mentioned Hezbollah. So the Amal militia and the Hezbollah militia in Lebanon, in some ways pioneered hostage taking. There were American hostages who were taken in the following the Israeli invasion of 1982, which resulted in the killing of 17,000 Lebanese and Palestinian civilians. This is when Israel invaded Lebanon, set siege to the city of Beirut, destroyed much of Beirut in an effort to destroy the Palestine Liberation Organization, which was a secular nationalist movement at the time. And I'll come back to that in a moment. But as a part of that, the U.S. military got involved with that, and we were sent in, and American hostages were taken. And there was well, of course, the Iranians took hostages after the 1979 revolution. And the Carter administration was largely undermined and contradicted that. I guess, but then Hamas has taken hostages and has learned that Israel is quite willing to make exchanges that are lopsided. So Israel is willing to release thousands of Palestinians for a handful of Israelis. And there are, many different instances of this prior to this moment. So this is a kind of tried and true tactic.
So we can conclude that what happened on October 7th was hostage taking was part of the plan, even if military was maybe the primary target.
That's right. And I think, Hamas did not expect to be able to just waltz in like this.
Yeah.
The Israeli military was not present, weirdly. And I think the expectation of those fighters was that they would die in the attempt to engage the Israeli military. They did not expect a breach like this. And partly, I think one of the reasons why, there was so much killing of unarmed non-combatants, civilians as well as military, who were not pointing guns at it, right? So they were not engaging in those situations. And so hostages were taken with the expectation of being able to win releases, right? Israel's response was pretty immediate and pretty massive and indiscriminate. And so we have seen yesterday, we are now at 18,800 Palestinians killed. We're not quite sure what the percentage of that are Hamas combatants who were quickly killed. Well, we know that 70% of the dead are women and children. So this is just simply a demographic reality. The vast majority of Gazans in the Gaza Strip are below the age of 18. It's a very young population. And it's a very densely populated area, one of the most densely populated areas in the world. This is, imagine like a war happening in the New York urban area, New York City urban. With that kind of population density, you're dropping 2,000-pound bombs, that are having a massive impact. And so it's not surprising to see these sorts of statistics. There are 51,000 injured. Hospitals have been damaged and destroyed. And so there's minimal access to medical care as a result. And then, as I mentioned, more than 1 million people have been displaced. The goal here, as I said at the top, seems to be collective punishment, holding the entire population responsible and attempting to reestablish deterrence, military deterrence, through a kind of overwhelming response. In other words, this is a form of communication, it's grisly, but it's a form of communication to other groups that are potential enemies of Israel. Hezbollah, Iran primarily, that if you do this to us, we will respond with overwhelming force and we will pay a very high price for this. This is sort of the realpolitik of this moment, and of the Israeli response. The Israelis were only able to do this because the Biden administration has given them a green light. They said it's okay for you to do this. The Biden administration has been trying to walk that back because the international response has been overwhelmingly condemnatory of Israel's indiscriminate action, right? And so the United States is deeply isolated right now internationally around this. And the Biden administration is increasingly confronting domestic political repercussions, right? And especially in battleground states. It's not clear how Michigan will go as a consequence of the impact of all of this on Arab and Muslim voters. And so there are a whole set of domestic considerations that are playing out here, as well as the role of Jewish communities that are supportive of Israel and are very well organized politically and able to exert political influence also. And so it's very complicated in the United States with respect to this issue. Biden himself is emotionally supportive, calls himself a Zionist, declared himself a Zionist, feels viscerally this whole situation and is deeply empathetic to Israel. And it's been sort of heartbreaking to see Muslim Americans and Arab Americans express how they feel completely ignored by President Biden in this moment. And so we don't know where this is headed, but we do know that the Biden administration is at an important crossroads here where some decisions have to be made. And you can sort of see them beginning to try to rein Israelis in. But whether or not they'll succeed really depends on President Biden's willingness to expend some political capital, to take some hits politically, potentially, for the larger goal of bringing this violence to an end and implementing what everybody knows needs to happen, which is some form of a two-state solution that is durable and viable. But to get there, the United States is going to have to confront the Israelis and be willing to use the leverage that the United States has with the state of Israel. Not the Palestinians. I mean, the Palestinians have their own dysfunctions, and there's things that have to happen there as well. But the Palestinians are by far the weaker party. The party that really has the ability to do something that can lead to sustained peace is the state of Israel. But there are some very difficult and complicated realities in the state of Israel as well, politically, that make all of this extremely hard, and one can despair very quickly of really being able to achieve anything.
So wasn't Netanyahu caught with his pants down, technically, and that's sometimes the reason for the overwhelming response?
Yes, in the same
Cover
way,
that up.
that George Bush was caught with his pants down on 9/11, right? Bush, in the sense of the United States, is caught with, metaphorically with its pants down. And the response of the United States after 9/11 was overwhelmingly disastrous for Afghanistan and then for Europe. And we're living with the consequences of all of that. And Israel will live with the consequences of what it's doing now in Gaza. Obviously, the Palestinians. So both of these are situations in which political leaders, weak political leaders, George Bush, Prime Minister Netanyahu, very weak political leaders. Netanyahu has been facing corruption charges and has been fighting for his political life for a while now. Something like this just simply continues to undermine their political support. And the response then is to try to respond in such a way that one can reassert one's strength, right? So Netanyahu has a lot riding on the outcome of all of this as well.
It's amazing they're pushing, killing a population. They come out and talk to us about, anti-Semitism and remember the Holocaust.
Well, yeah, that's an important discussion that I think we need. That's lurking in the background of all of this, right? It's this question of anti-Semitism and the Holocaust, and I guess what I would like to say is that we need to confront that anti-Semitism is real, that we have seen a 34% increase in anti-Semitic acts here in the United States in the past year, according to the FBI. There have also been large increases in anti-Muslim and anti-Arab racism at the same time. So anti-Semitism is a fact. And one that if we're going to have conversations with our Jewish American fellow citizens, that needs to be acknowledged up front, as well as the responsibility that Christians, Western Christians, have historically for anti-Judaism and anti-Semitism, beginning already with the New Testament, right? And so this is deep. It's a deep responsibility. At the same time, that cannot be allowed to be used as a way to silence any kind of critical discussion of literature. And so it's a very difficult conversation to have, and when you try to have it in public, it's very hard to be heard, and it's very easy to have your words taken out of context and to be accused of being anti-Semitic or being critical of Israel. And part of that is that supporters of Israel, including the Holocaust Memorial Museum, I'm not sure exactly, the International Holocaust Museum, or I forget exactly the name of the organization, it's come out with a definition of anti-Semitism that includes, they're very careful about this, forms of criticism of Israel. So to be critical of Israel, this is within their official definition of anti-Semitism, to be critical of Israel can be anti-Semitic. So it's very unclear, right, when you begin to criticize Israel, how that's going to be heard. And that's just simply, there are a lot of reasons for that, right? Because of the way in which Israel historically has presented itself as a response to anti-Semitism, as a response to the Holocaust, right? As a response to the long history of Christian European violence toward Jews. In a lot of ways, what we are seeing here in Gaza is the long unfolding consequence of the failure of Europe and the failure of Western Christianity to affirm Jews, to accept Jews, and to live with Jewish communities side by side in peace and in a sense of solidarity and shared community. The history has been quite the other way around. A history of blood libel, a history of crusade, a history of persecution, a history of pogroms, state-sponsored persecutions of Jews, and obviously the Holocaust. None of this can be minimized. We cannot minimize that. And to point our fingers and say, you Jews should know better, you Israelis should know better, you went through the Holocaust after all, you should know better. I mean, Israel is behaving like any other state would behave. It is behaving like the United States behaved after 9/11. Right? This is how states behave. And it is not helpful. It is not helpful to engage in this kind of moral accusation. You Jews should know better. Well, maybe we Christians need to do a hell of a lot more work with understanding where anti-Semitism comes from and asking ourselves, why does it continue? Why are we seeing increases in anti-Semitism in Europe, in the United States? Why is that? Part of Israel-Palestine and unlocking that is addressing anti-Semitism here. Now that I've said that, I refuse to allow anti-Semitism to be used as a way to shut down legitimate criticism of what the state of Israel is doing, or to justify what's happened to the Palestinians historically. That somehow the Palestinians are responsible for this historically, no, they're not. The Palestinians have contributed to their own suffering through their own mistakes. Yes, there was a legitimate criticism there that one has to enter into an honest discussion with Palestinians about. Have violence served you? Have these acts of terror served you? are there other ways to go about this? Are there other choices to be made? And I would argue that what happened on October 7th was never inevitable. There were other choices to be made. The oppressed always have choices in terms of how they respond to their oppression. But one thing I refuse to do is to blame Palestinians for that oppression, for that situation of oppression that has come about and that's defined by other people.
Okay. You don't need to elaborate on this if you don't want to, but when you mentioned a few minutes ago about this, so we got the United States and Israel, the major player. How do you factor in Iran, given that we have no, probably zero leverage with that nation? Go back 40 years to hostage taking and all that, but you have any thoughts about how to think about that large framework of, that's a big deal, but
That's difficult, right? I mean, I think that both Iran and the United States have been so invested in demonizing one another.
exactly.
Um,
Briefing some of what we said.
Well, there are political benefits for the leaders of Iran to continue to demonize the United States. There are certain elements, right? But there have been other elements within the Iranian leadership that have attempted to develop a rapprochement and to move in a different direction. I mean, at one point, under the Obama administration, there were efforts to come to some kind of agreement around the nuclear issue, right? And then, there was an opening there. But within both Iran and the United States and within Israel as well, there are political factions and elements that have come to power that have pursued very different, more conflictual approaches. The Trump administration, for example, right, pursued a very different approach. But Benjamin Netanyahu have been much more aggressive. So the role that Iran plays in all of this is, obviously supporting, armed militias regionally as points of leverage for them with the United States, with Israel. It's aligned with Russia. How does the United States respond to that? Well, I think one thing that could be a real game changer would be to resolve the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And take that out of the equation. And how do you do that? Well, you have to move to some form of a two-state solution. And that's only going to happen if the United States is willing to put enough pressure on the Israelis, the way that the first Bush administration did when it threatened to not provide housing subsidies. It was $10 billion or $10 million. A large amount of money. When the first Bush administration did this in the early 1990-91, it forced Israel to the Madrid peace conference. So it's incorrect to say that the United States has no leverage with Israel. It does. It just hasn't had the political will from one administration to another, with the exception of the first Bush administration.
And he lost.
We lost after one term, right?
And we're going into an election year.
So who knows? I mean, we could get Trump again, but I think that resolving these conflicts, if the United States could be, I'm not holding my breath here, but I'm just saying, if the United States would pursue a policy that would seriously lead to a viable Palestinian state alongside Israel, that would go an unimaginable distance toward addressing some of these larger regional issues, right, that are that involve Iran. Another one would be to actually go back to the negotiating table with Iran and deal with the nuclear question and not take a belligerent stance. So I would think this would be in the best interest of the United States. However, what is in the best interest of the United States is in the eye of the beholder. So you have different political factions in the United States that have different, among the elites, who have different understandings of what the United States needs to do globally. All of us in this room have very little control over what happens.
Yeah.
We're going to have control because the elites, the ones who decide these things. Yeah.
It's interesting, the New York Times just this morning, there's an editorial essay by David Hardin and Larry Garber. Hardin was a former senior advisor to President Obama's special envoy for Middle East peace, and Mr. Garber served as the USAID mission director to the West Bank and Gaza. And they, among the several suggestions in there, is one that if the U.S. would recognize the Palestinian government and open an embassy there, not to cancel the one with Israel, that would give a message to the world and to the Palestinians that we recognize their right to a separate nationhood. And it seemed to me certainly a very provocative idea, but they say that President Biden does not need congressional approval to do that. He can unilaterally recognize the West Bank and the Palestinians, and that way that evens it out and shows America is recognizing that we agree that those people have a right to their own state.
Yeah, this is an idea actually that Daoud Kutab, who is a Palestinian Christian and journalist, it must be in the 70s by now. I knew him when I was living in Beit Jama. He published something in the Washington Post a few weeks ago, making the same argument, asking or urging that the United States recognize the state of Palestine, which it never has. A bunch of other countries have, and Palestinians have a place, some kind of status at the UN. But this would be a very powerful, would lend powerful diplomatic legitimacy, obviously, right, to a Palestinian state, even though one doesn't exist at the moment in any sort of territorial reality. It would create a political reality, and it would, I think, very powerfully energize this movement. Now, that recognition without tangible actions taken to actually create that state is meaningless. And so what is implied there with recognition? Well, what's implied with recognition is a long, it's a deep commitment to a long process of political transformation and a willingness, as I said, to put pressure on the Israelis to do this.
That would also take a big step to reducing our American isolation on the world stage as a one-sided ally of Israel and against the Palestinians.
Yeah, and it would also begin to take control back of this entire situation away from Israel's war planners, who seem to be impervious to, the Biden administration's pleadings, and change the whole dynamic completely. Now, the question is, who among the Palestinians do you work with? Well, the Palestinian political infrastructure is a shambles and is deeply dysfunctional. You have, Mahmoud Abbas, who's the head of the Palestinian Authority, a longtime PLO, one of the founders of the PLO, who's in his 80s, who has absolutely no legitimacy. He's perceived as deeply corrupt. There have been no elections since 2007 or 2006. And he rules a fiefdom in Ramallah, the town of Ramallah. His security forces are seen as basically doing the bidding of the Israeli military, repressing Palestinians on behalf of the Israeli military without any kind of tangible gain for them. And so there's a need for new Palestinian leadership. There's a need for elections. There's a need for, and then there's Hamas, right, which kicked the PLO out of Gaza in 2007 in a brief and bloody civil war, and took control of the Gaza Strip. And the Israelis are, committed to destroying Hamas, whatever that means. Maybe destroying Hamas's military capabilities, but it won't destroy the organization. And it certainly won't destroy Palestinian commitment to resistance. So this is, I don't know what they mean by that, destroying commence. But what is needed is to take Palestinians seriously, give them the opportunity to elect new leaders, and to, reinvigorate some kind of Palestinian political infrastructure that can speak for Palestinians. And so, that in itself is extremely difficult to achieve under these conditions. And then you have the settlers, the Israeli settlers who are hell-bent on annexing the West Bank. There are 700,000 Israeli settlers during this. Much of this settlement building has been intensified and increased all throughout the Oslo peace process and into the present moment. When I was doing my PhD dissertation research in Bethlehem in 1999-2000, at the very end of the Oslo process, and a good friend of mine, who was a shop owner in Bethlehem, pointed to the settlement that was being built on Jebel Abu Ghneim, this land that belonged to the Bethlehem Beit Zahot. The Israelis called it Har Homa, and this huge settlement. It was part of this chain of gigantic settlements that encircled Jerusalem, built in the West Bank, was going up in the midst of supposedly peace negotiations. Right? And so this was, something that was ongoing, right? And it didn't matter whether it was Netanyahu or Rabin, or it didn't matter which government, right? These settlements had been built, whether it was a Labour government or Likud government or whatever. This has been a long-standing Israeli policy that has transcended political administrations in Israel. And it's been aimed at solidifying Israeli control of Jerusalem and the West Bank. Long-standing Israeli policy. And the debate among Israelis was whether or not to allow Palestinians a certain amount of autonomy, so that we Israelis don't have to be directly in control of them through military occupation, or we Israelis need to annex everything and maintain Palestinians essentially in some kind of apartheid-like situation. What we have basically seen is that annexation policy being implemented. And so Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch last year or 2 years ago came out with very controversial but very public statements that indeed what we are seeing in the occupied territories is apartheid. They named it as apartheid, fitting the definition of apartheid. So, this has been a choice that Israeli leaders have pursued, and I think the long game for them is to make life as miserable as possible so that more and more Palestinians leave. And Israeli demographic dominance continues to increase as more and more settlers move into the occupied territories and into Jerusalem. It's the long game. And this is how, this has been one of the important emphases within Zionism, has been, how to achieve a demographic majority in order to establish and sustain a Jewish state. The problem, of course, is that this has never been just a Jewish area, right? And it's always been multi-ethnic, multi-religious. And so when you impose on that a project of building a ethnically exclusive political entity, the state that is ethnically exclusive, that privileges one ethnicity, how do you maintain control over those who don't fit into that ethnic category? That's the dominant category. It becomes a challenge. It becomes Israel's fundamental challenge. And so I completely ignored my PowerPoint. I guess a couple of points I want to make is that the violence that is happening now is really a culmination of a series of wars that have been occurring all throughout the 2000s. And I had a whole list I had printed out of these different conflicts that have occurred. I've mentioned the breakdown of the Palestinian political institutions, and as well as Israel's, especially under Netanyahu, Israel's commitment to undermining a two-state solution through the development of settlements and maintaining territorial control. The Trump administration has also played a role here recently in its effort to, cut deals with Arab governments and cut out the Palestinians. You might remember the Abrahamic Accords that Trump presided over that cemented diplomatic negotiation and acknowledgement, recognition of Israel by different Arab states. The Biden administration essentially has continued the Trump policy, has sought to negotiate recognition by the Saudis of Israel. The Saudis would love to have this deal done, but then October 7th completely overturned all of that, and that, for now at least, is off the table. But the whole point was to just simply do an end run around the Palestinians, ignore the Palestinian issue. So one thing that we have to be honest about is that the attack on October 7th, which was utterly horrendous, a war crime, a crime against humanity, has had a positive political impact for Palestinians in the sense that it has put the Palestinian issue back on and at the center of international attention,
That's good.
where it had been buried, right? But it had come at such a horrendous price, right? And I don't know that, was this worth it? I don't know that it's necessarily. I can't say that it was worth it in the sense of the loss of life, but I'm pointing to it just simply to say that this is part of why this happened, is that Hamas saw that the Palestinians were being ignored and wanted, in a sense, to put the issue back front and center through this armed attack, to say you can't ignore us. So, if violence is the only thing that Americans understand, if violence is the only thing that Israelis understand, if violence is the only thing that the international community understands, then what are people to do other than to act violently? A couple of years ago, Palestinians attempted to march non-violently on the Gaza border fence, and Israeli snipers cut down hundreds of them. And the international community didn't care. The international community did not respond. Attempts by the Palestinians to launch boycott, divestment, and sanctions on the model of the South African campaign have been beaten down, and there have been all kinds of laws passed, including here in Ohio, making it illegal to engage in boycott, divestment, and sanctions against Israel. So these attempts to respond non-violently have gone seemingly nowhere. I would argue that Palestinians haven't been committed enough to strategic nonviolence as a fundamental value and a fundamental strategic direction that is sustained, even in the face of defeats. Now, there's been a kind of fetishizing and worshiping of the gun in Palestinian culture, political culture, that has had disastrous results for Palestinians. And, who am I to criticize? I'm not a Palestinian, but this is my viewpoint, that violence has had disastrous consequences over and over and over again for Palestinians. But I think we can understand why Palestinians would pick up the rifle, right? As one possible response to their experience and their situation, the conditions of oppression. Even if it's gotten them somewhere. One has to be honest about that. It has put the Palestinian issue on the map repeatedly, these acts of violence, but it has also cemented a view of Palestinians as terrorists, and has also resulted in massive violent responses by the state of Israel and by the United States that have created unbelievable decimation and destruction of Palestinian lives. And so when you look at this, you say, well, what has violence actually achieved for Palestinians? Not much, except really profound suffering. I don't know whether strategic nonviolence in the form of, say, the civil rights movement in this country or Gandhi's Satyagraha campaign would have succeeded, but it's not really been seriously tried, other than during the first Palestinian uprising in some ways, which was mostly nonviolent, which actually did succeed in gaining international recognition of the Palestinian issue and leading to the peace process for all its problems and failures. Yeah.
When I was there 7 years ago, I think the thing that's hard to realize here in America is how it was hard for me to see the Palestinians not be more angry at the conditions that they were living under. And when I think of Gaza being bombed and you talk about New York City, you know, the other thing about it is that you can't, then you gotta think, and you can't get out of New York City because they got you surrounded. So you have to move to this part of New York City, supposedly not to get bombed, and that, you know, but you can't get away from it.
Right.
And to not have, I mean, Americans would just not deal. We can't even understand it. I don't think that degree of powerlessness that Palestinians live
Well,
in.
I think that's right. In the United States, unless you are, Native American, African American, you don't have that in you because you haven't experienced it collectively. It's not in your memory. Or Jewish. If you're Jewish, maybe you actually do have something that you have inherited as a memory within your families. Of powerlessness, of overwhelming violence being used against you, genocide. But for white Americans who are the children of immigrants to this country, we have not collectively experienced this kind of. So it's hard. It's hard to understand what that is like. I think our routines of our daily lives take over, right? I mean, I don't think about that every single second. There's that luxury of not having to do that. So it's I've often wrestled with the knowledge that I have not done enough. For my friends in particular, in Israel, who giving points, beseeched me to help them get out. And my response was, I can't sponsor you. I don't have the wherewithal to sponsor you in your families you come here. Was that true? I don't know if that was true. I could have made different decisions around it. It would have had different consequences for my life, but I could have done something there, at least for that family. And had I done that 20 years ago, they would not be possibly dead now. So, I think it's important not to, there are things that get put in the path of your life and you make decisions around them and they have consequences. And this is one of those consequences that I haven't done that.
Well, hindsight's 100%.
Well, and it's also very easy to justify these things for yourself. You give yourself all sorts of excuses for not acting.
At least we can think about it. At least we can think about it.
Well, I think it's important to not let yourself off the hook. But there's a temptation also to wallow in self-loathing, which is another way of not doing anything. So,
Sorry.
no, I'm here in front of you as maybe a way of atoning, but also sincere commitments to wanting to have conversations like this. I've completely gone off script, but you want to know where Hamas comes from? I've written about this quite extensively. You can talk with you about that. I'll just say quickly
Is
about.
Hamas equal Palestinians?
That's a great question. No. Yes and no. Hamas is a movement that literally means it comes from the Palestinian or the Islamic resistance. It's the reverse acronym. It's a movement. That's not a reverse acronym. It's a straightforward movement of Islamic resistance. It's a movement that comes out of the Muslim Brotherhood. And the Muslim Brotherhood is an organization and a movement that is global in its reach, but has its origins in Egypt in the 1920s. And it was a response to British colonialism. A lot of stuff goes back to British colonialism. That's regional. And then, of course, the United States inherits British colonial imperial power after the Second World War. right? And so we take the place of it. Originates in the Muslim Brotherhood, and the Muslim Brotherhood becomes active in the Gaza Strip during the 1970s and 1980s. So that's
So is that like a political party for us to think about, Muslim Brotherhood?
it is like, yes, it is a political movement, but it's more than that. It's a social, cultural, religious, political movement, all wrapped up together, kind of like evangelicalism in the United States. Evangelicalism in the United States, conservative evangelicalism in the United States. I know it's complicated, very complex about that. Conservative evangelicalism in the United States is social, it's cultural, and it's heavily political. And is very involved, obviously, in our political system through the Republican Party. Evangelicals include the evangelical with futures, you know, it's a big category, right? It's a very complicated term. One strain of evangelicalism that had a presence in my family growing up was Jim Wallace and the Sojourners community. So there's that stream of evangelicalism that my mother was really tapped into, social justice around it. But then we had evangelicalism in the form of Jerry, well, lots kind of fundamentalism, but Jerry Falwell, you know, various political formations that have developed around this, right? And that included Christian Zionism. You guys know about Christian Zionism? No. Okay. So I think I mentioned it further down in my telephone. Christian Zionism develops, you know, goes back to the 1920s there. The Schofield Interpreter's Bible, thing. It's an ideology and a movement that has a long history in the United States that is really centered around the idea that Israel is a fulfillment of biblical prophecy, and that the ingathering of the Jews in the modern state of Israel is an important moment in the unfolding of the eventual return of Jesus and so forth. And it's a real theology. Dave can probably speak about it much more authoritatively than I can. But it has had a huge impact among conservative evangelicals. The state of Israel has opportunistically sought to harness this for the political support of Israel, to reinforce political support of Israel in the United States. And so the Israeli state has subsidized the travel of Christian pilgrim groups to the Holy Land, led by some of these Christian Zionist preachers and church leaders. And these are big tours. And every year there's a huge march in Jerusalem, a gathering of Christian Zionists in Jerusalem. They march in Jerusalem, waving Israeli flags. So it's a kind of American form of American nationalism that views the state of Israel as the culmination of biblical prophecy and argues that the United States and Christians in the United States, in order to be right with God and to be on the right side of salvation history, needs to be supportive of the state of Israel.
They also pay to take state legislators to Israel. Now, whether they participate in all of the marches and all of that, but each year there is a whole group of state legislators that go over to Israel.
Oh, sure.
And that come back and then will pass, you know, the can't think of words anymore, but pass the resolutions in support of Israel, pass the bills that say you can't invest. I mean, that's
Or support the aid, right, that is given to Israel.
Yeah.
Israel is the largest recipient of U.S. foreign aid, and has been for a long time, probably leaps and bounds. Literally, it's not even Iraq. Egypt, I think, was number 2, but a foreign number 2 for a long time. And Israel's a highly technologized, wealthy society. It's just you sit there scratching your head like, why are they recipient of so much aid? Much of it was military. But a part of that is, actively, I mean, kudos to the Israelis, they're doing what every other state does with an interest in bringing US favor. The Saudis, every country is has a foothold in Washington through some lobby group. The Israelis are no exception. So you would expect that, right? I mean, they're just being smart and seeing to their own interests. But it is really way out of proportion the amount of aid that's given to Israelis. So anyway, Christian Zionism, it's something to find out about and to really think about the activists, members of the church here. I don't know whether you encounter this in your conversations with family or with other members of churches elsewhere in the Columbus area, but it is a phenomenon.
So I work out at the Jewish Center. There's a woman I trained with who's not Jewish, but she a couple of weeks ago said, "I couldn't wait to talk to you today." I was, well, okay. And she said, "I'm talking to my evangelical aunt and cousin who belongs to this Traders Point, mega church in Indianapolis. They had somebody in to talk about the whole thing going on, and my trainer asked them, well, who do you support? So, of course we support Israel. And why is that? Because we're Christians. Bingo. I mean, that's right. And all the background was the Zionism. I tried with traverse that I tried to explain a little bit.
Well, it's really hard to unpack that, right? But I think one place to begin is the New Testament, and to begin with, the Sermon on the Mount, but also to begin with Palestinian Christians. It was a small but important Palestinian Christian community whose descendants go way back in generations to the very beginnings of Christianity. But they're invisible.
I did try to explain that, but I've known some Palestinian Christians and say, look, but they're more Scots.
I know.
Those folks are totally lost in the media conversation. It seems to me we think only Palestinians have an Islamic background, but what about Christians?
Right. I mean, and I mentioned the Lutheran Church in Bethlehem. So the Lutherans went back to the period of colonialism when the Germans were trying to get in the game. Sent German missionaries and actually created important institutions, educational institutions in Bethlehem, Beit-Jala, and in Gaza. And so I would urge you, as members of the LCA, to maybe think about, a church commitment that would support something that the Lutherans are doing in the homeland. Even maybe partner with the church, or establish some kind of relationship with the church. Maybe invite somebody like Reverend Mideast to address the church, maybe online. He just came out with a book recently by reviewing. It's a good one. It takes up this question of why the Bible sometimes is so hard for Palestinian Christians to read, especially when you have Christian Zionist movements using the Bible as a way to completely delegitimize and to ignore what this experience is like for Palestinian Christians. So, but he's very thoughtful about this. He takes up the whole question of election, the choosing of Abraham, the choosing of Israel. What does election mean? How do we as Palestinian Christians understand election? And his answer to that is that election is God's own. Just election can be given, it can be taken away, but that it's ultimately God's decision. And in the sense, you're all elected, you're all chosen, you're all called, right? So I thought that was a really powerful and important kind of theological intervention and reflection that he had. It's a very thoughtful theologian. I'm out of time here, I think. I'm happy to leave my PowerPoint with Dave, and I'm sorry for not sticking to it, but I think you've abandoned it. Those of you online, thank you for joining, and thank you all of you for attending. I hope it was somewhat productive.
Yes, let's see.
school fees.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. She kind of has some strangeness, you know.
That's the old one.
Yeah, that's it's been 9 years now. So I'm just gonna have to get your much show initially the hours. Standardizing things to get her celebration and speed and Tracy. So you understand, yeah. Seems to understand what you need to do. That's the honest work.